Good evening, everyone. Welcome along to this information session for our current Year 11 VCAL students and their parents. My name's Simon McCart. I'm the VCAL coordinator at Mount Clear College, and I'm also joined by Sarah Fort, who is a new Vet Innovation Coordinator. Sarah, did you want to introduce yourself and talk briefly about your new role?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Apologies, my camera is having a bit of a malfunction moment at the moment, so that's okay. I can hear everyone, and as long as you can hear me. So my role at Mount Clear College is to assist with not only the vet side of things within the school, but also assist students with securing work placements and structured workplace learning that coordinates within their vet programs.
Fantastic.
Did you need me to elaborate on anything else, or?
No, that's good, Sarah. We'll get you to jump in at different points through the presentation.
That's okay.
So, yeah, thank you. So the purpose of this presentation, we're very mindful this has been a very disrupted year for our VCAL students, as it has been for all students, and we haven't had perhaps the normal avenues of communication and connection with our students and their families. So we wanted to make sure we could reach out through this online forum and make sure our students are set up for a pathway to success in 2022, whichever avenue that takes them. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about four main things. One is the pathway for those students who are definitely looking at going on to complete their studies in Year 12, so to complete a further year of VCAL studies at Mount Clear. I'm also going to talk about the pathway for those students who are looking at perhaps exiting at the end of Year 11, so completing their VCAL studies at the end of this year and then going on to do either full-time work or some sort of apprenticeship or traineeship. And then just so we're really clear about the general expectations for all of our students going forward, I'll talk about the role that vet and work placement play in the 3-day timetable for VCAL and help you just understand what we mean by applied learning a little bit better, so your children are set up for success next year. So I'll start with the three main pathways really for our students. All of the Year 11 students this year are currently enrolled in what is called an intermediate level VCAL certificate. There are actually 3 levels of award in VCAL. Foundation is the bottom one. We don't really offer a foundation VCAL at Mount Clear College. So intermediate is sort of notionally the level that VCAL is taught at Year 11 in most secondary schools. As I mentioned earlier, there'll be several students who will choose to exit at the end of Year 11 with an intermediate VCAL certificate if they've successfully completed all their outcomes. Or some of them may need to, if they haven't finished the certificate, go on to complete it at Year 12. Ideally though, most students will complete their intermediate level certificate in Year 11 and then go on to complete a senior level certificate at Year 12. Now it's important to just bear in mind that the actual level that students end up exiting with is really going to be determined by the level of initiative they show and their sort of numeracy and literacy skill level as well. Okay, so it's not necessarily guaranteed that all students will exit at Year 12 with a senior certificate. So if they're the 3 pathways, I'd like to talk at this point about the options for those students at Year 11 who are looking at exiting at the end of the year, perhaps with an intermediate certificate. In order to do that, it's important to understand that a VCAL certificate is made up of 5 strands, and each strand represents a certain learning area. So we have personal development skills, which looks at the development of the individual and is largely a project-based course. And there are 2 units there, PDS Unit 1 and 2. Then we have the work readiness course, work-related skills, which tries to teach students essential skills to get them ready for work and make them active and efficient job seekers as well. And then we have our foundation sort of literacy and numeracy skill programs. And then finally, industry-specific skills, which is students' vet learning. Now, to get their certificate, they need 10 units. So it's really important. The first thing to understand is that if a student gets to the end of this year and they have not completed just one of their 10 units, they don't have a pathway to a certificate. This is why it's really important that our VCAL students in Year 11 attend to all of their studies and try their best to complete all of the units that they're enrolled in. If they have any ambition or aspiration to leave at the end of this year with a certificate to go on to do work or a traineeship or an apprenticeship, just missing out on 1 unit could be the difference between passing and failing. Okay, there are a few options that might help them out though at this point. The first is we have many students who come into Year 11 VCAL who may have completed vet studies in year 10, and that would give them 2 extra units, because essentially a vet unit would have been completed in semester 1 of year 10 and then another one in semester 2. If that's the case, the student will end up with 11 units out of the 10 that they need, and that gives them a big tick and the pathway to a certificate at the end of year 11. The other option for students who may fall short with certificates, VCAL certificates in this year, is if they have completed any VCE units. Now, we do have several students who have joined, and it typically happens each year that we have students who join VCAL partway through the year coming from the VCE. Any VCE units that a student has completed in the first semester do count towards their certificate. So even just 1 extra VCE unit from semester 1 would count and make up the 10 units they need. Okay. Now, for students who are continuing on to year 12, the minimum required is actually 1 unit in each of those strands, so you can't afford to not pass a unit in at least one of those strands, but you also need to have passed 6 units. So it's 5 plus an extra unit. And typically we'd like to think that is PDS unit 2, but it can be any other unit, including any VCE or VET units. So if you're a year 11 student this year who wants to go to year 12, you must pass a minimum of 6 of the 10 units you're enrolled in this year. Okay. If you're unfortunate enough to only have the 5, even if you've met all of the strand requirements, unfortunately you don't have a pathway to a certificate. And at that point, we may be having a conversation with you about whether it's actually a better pathway for you if you want to stay at school to complete year 11 again. And that is because you won't necessarily have all of the foundation skills and competencies that you need to be successful in year 12. So hopefully that clarifies the pathways. We really want our students and their parents to be aware of the minimum requirements, so that when we reach the end of the year, there are no surprises. And you're aware that if you want to exit at the end of the year with an intermediate certificate, you must have those 10 units. And to get into year 12, you need that minimum of 6. I should also clarify that you probably won't have a pathway to year 12 if you don't meet one of the strand requirements. So here we have 2, 4, 6, 8 units, but we're missing literacy skills. So here, even if you had an additional VCE or VET unit, it might not necessarily guarantee you a pathway to year 12 because you're missing a core skill there, being literacy skills, and that whole strand is missing. Okay, so it's important to achieve some success in all of your units. If you're aiming to and do go on to year 12, then to complete year 12, if you carry over those 6 units from year 11, they would typically combine with having to pass, again, 6 units in year 12 and 1 in each of the strands. So in year 12, you'd have to pass a senior level PDS, WRS, literacy, numeracy, and a VET unit. All right, so that's the sort of rules and expectations around students transitioning at the end of the year. For those students who are looking at continuing next year, and even for those students who have the remainder of their studies this year to complete, I think it's just important to clarify VCAL's program structure, why the students are only on a part-time timetable. Often this is a bit of a mystery to some of our parents. It's not really well understood why. So I just wanted to explain that in a VCAL program, whether it's in year 11 or year 12, our students are on a part-time timetable that sees them at Mount Clear College for only 3 days per week. The other 2 days are meant to be made up of 1 day on work placement. Now, VCAL is meant to be a vocational program, set students up for success in vocational work. So 1 day is set aside for them to gain valuable work experience in an industry that they would like to work in, or ideally to have a experience in several different industries just to test which ones they might best be suited to. I appreciate it's very difficult at the moment with COVID and other restrictions limiting access to work, but it is an expectation that that day off is set aside not to do nothing, but to be either actively seeking work or to be gaining valuable employment. That second day, the second day that is set aside in the timetable is for students to either be attending or completing the theory work they need to do for their VET studies. Okay, so that gives them actually in the end a full 5-day timetable, but it is made up of only 3 days at Mount Clear, 1 day of work placement and 1 day of VET. So now I'd just like to talk briefly about how work placement fits in then and the expectations around how that works in terms of its relationship with the VCAL certificate. So as I said earlier, VCAL is a vocational pathway. It's meant to set students up for success in work, so you are expected to complete regular work experience. If you have a good reason for not doing it, then we're happy to discuss that with you, and we'll work with students on a case-by-case basis. But as a general rule, if you're coming into VCAL, we really want you to come in with that mindset that you are going to, as a student, be actively looking for work, and as a parent, you're going to be supporting your child to find work for 1 day per week. Having said that, I do have to be upfront and say that there is actually no minimum hours requirement for a VCAL certificate. So there is no magic number of work experience hours that you need to complete. So we don't want our students to be anxious either that if they're struggling to find work, particularly in the industry they want to work in, and it is tough at the moment, that they're somehow going to be disadvantaged or not given a certificate. Having said that, many of our students are completing VET certificates, and many of those courses, like allied health, for example, do have a minimum hours requirement. Sarah, at this point, I might invite you. Did you want to talk briefly to this? I think this is important for our parents perhaps to understand this a little bit better. Did you want to talk about the subjects that are affected here and how that works?
Yep, absolutely. So there are a few VET programs that hold a mandatory requirement of work placement that needs to be completed in order to successfully receive the appropriate certificate. So as an example, salon assistant. Now this was a new one for this year. There's actually 40 hours of work placement that needs to be completed in order to obtain the certificate. However, I know that in a lot of the practical classes at the TAFE, some of those hours have been attributed to that 40 hours. So each student should know roughly how many hours they need to, or if they have completed. So that is a mandatory one. So salon assistants. Allied health also has an 80-hour mandatory work placement requirement. Now, obviously, that's a really tricky one with current climate and lockdowns and things like that and restrictions. So if there are any students that haven't done any work placement towards their allied health 80 hours, it's really important that you let either Simon or myself know, and we can have a chat with you about what your options are. And the final one, which I don't think, no, that's okay. It's the active volunteering, which I don't believe, Simon, are any of our students enrolled in that one?
No, early childhood though, would that be?
Yes, yeah. So last but not least, the early childhood. So that one has 120 hours of mandatory placement associated with it. So that one, we've been pretty lucky in terms of being able to put our students in primary schools and early childhood learning settings. Again, there is the 120 hours that are required for that one. So if any of the students haven't met those, again, it's vital that they contact us so we can get that, get an action plan in place for them. So all of the other VET requirements are strongly recommended. So even though they're not mandatory, they are really recommended so the students can actually put the skills that they're learning into an actual workplace. So there are, depending on what the VET program is, it's usually around about 80 hours of work placement that is strongly recommended in that industry. So if there are any students out there that haven't done any work placement or haven't done, around about at least half of the 80 hours, get in contact with us and we can see what we can do.
And I'd just say there that any student, for example, an allied health, early childhood or salon assistant student who has actively looked for the work they need and through no fault of their own hasn't achieved it, there may be implications for their certificate, but I'm sure the providers are looking at arrangements to, if they're rolling over for a second year, for example, to complete their hours next year. And you also won't be disadvantaged for your VCAL certificate. So it wouldn't be grounds, for example, for holding you back from progressing into year 12. So just want to assure people that if you've done the right thing, you won't be disadvantaged in that sense. Probably also just worth clarifying that your hours set aside for that 1 day per week for work placement for VCAL, they're not extra hours on top of the hours that you might need to do for your vet certificate. So if you have to do 1 day per week for salon assistant, then that counts towards your VCAL certificate. It's not like you have to do extra work experience for VCAL on top of that, if that makes sense. All right, so in terms of how much work experience, as I said, there's no minimum requirement, but there are maximum caps that you need to be aware of. Our students cannot do more than 10 days per term. This is typically 1 day per week, so a term usually running for 10 weeks equals 10 days. But there is some flexibility here, so there are options for students to do block placements. So typically that would be 2 5-day blocks each term. And that might be preferable for some students who need that more extended time to, particularly if it's a job trial, for example, and they're trying to test out the job before maybe going on to take up an apprenticeship or full-time work. That might be a preferred option. And there might be some settings or locations that it's more practical to do it that way. The other restriction that we'd ask you just to be aware of is that students are not really allowed to do more than 20 days per year with the one employer. So essentially that's a half year. There are lots of reasons for this, and this is a restriction put in place by the Department of Education. But setting that aside, really one of the advantages of doing work placement is getting exposure to lots of different workplaces and not just putting all your eggs in one basket. Even though you might be very passionate about working in a particular setting, this idea of getting lots of different experiences is really valuable. Okay, so just be aware. Some students do get a bit upset when we get to the middle of the year and we have to explain to them that even though they might be enjoying their time at that employer, they can't work there any longer. There are a few exceptions. We can apply for an extension, and Lanita Taylor, the principal here, can approve that, but that would only really be done on a case-by-case basis. There are other complex restrictions I won't go into here, but a lot of them have to do with safety. So you can imagine students who want to work closely with animals, particularly horses, that can be a very dangerous environment to work in. There are some definite limitations about where and what sort of settings our students can work in. All right. So as I said before, variety is good. Please look at this work placement as an opportunity to try before you buy. I can think of many occasions where, for example, I've had a student come to me and say, Mr. McCart, I'm really passionate about working with children. That's my dream job. That's really what I want to do. I love it. And they get out on their first day at a childcare centre, and they come back the next day and they're in tears, and it was just awful and not what they expected. And they have to revise completely their understanding of what work they're suited to. So please don't come into this with a really fixed mindset. Really important that you explore as many different opportunities as you can through the year. So variety is important. I said before that students and parents are expected to organise their own work placement. So this is something that, looking ahead to next year, we would love parents and students over the summer break, if they're coming back to do VCAL in Year 12, to be actively looking for work over the break, so that in that first week back, or very, very soon thereafter, you can be working as soon as possible at the beginning of the year. Okay, we don't want you to just come back and really start to think about it when you get back to school. It's probably something that we'd like you to be thinking about and actively looking over the summer break. Now, there is some support available. Sarah, do you want to talk again about perhaps your role there and what support you and the college can provide?
Absolutely. Sorry about that. There was a question that came through just before, while we were having a bit of a chat about hours and things. There was a question about auto. I'm assuming the question meant how many hours or whether that is recommended or mandatory. So the automotive is not one of the mandatory structured workplace learning vet programs. However, it is strongly recommended that there is 160 hours completed. So that's 4 weeks. So again, even though it does sound a lot, it isn't mandatory, but they do encourage you to get as much experience in an automotive setting with an employer as possible. So in terms of support that can be offered, we, as Mr. McCart mentioned before, we do expect the students to take every initiative for themselves to actually locate and secure a work placement. We do have a lot of contacts within industries and employers out in the community. However, we do expect students to at least come to us and give us an indication of which employers they've tried and some of the barriers that they're experiencing. Obviously, COVID lockdowns is going to be a really big one. And when the department actually bans all work placements, our hands are tied there. So even if an industry is open and operating, if the department have put a stop to all work placements, unfortunately, we can't override that. Was there anything else you needed me to touch on, Simon?
No, it's great. Thank you, Sarah. Cheers for that. The other thing that is listed there is WRS, which is work-related skills, which is one of the 5 core subjects in VCAL that I mentioned previously. 2 things about that. In work-related skills, the teacher in that subject will provide active support to the students to support them, enable them to look for work. So that includes things like building up their cold calling skills, so practicing their telephone calling, their job interview skills, getting their resume up to date, developing a cover letter. So lots of really practical things that they do in that subject to help support the students to get ready to be active job seekers. It's also one of the reasons why we really strongly encourage and expect students to complete work placement, because to be successful in that subject, students will do much better if they are actually working for an extended period in the sort of industry area that they would like to work in, because they will be learning about occupational health and safety, working conditions, pay and conditions. That stuff is much more meaningful if they have an actual job to relate it to. Otherwise, it becomes very abstract and less engaging and less meaningful for the student. So really important that they have work, if for no other reason that it will actually inform and filter through all of the work, not just in work-related skills, but in fact all of the subjects in VCAL. Really important that parents and students are aware that you cannot just go out and do a work placement without having completed all the necessary paperwork. So this will be given to students at different times throughout the year. Especially at the start of the year next year for the next round, sort of large round of work placements going into year 12. So that paperwork actually covers students for insurance purposes. So it's really important that it's completed properly, so that if a student is injured in the workplace, they're covered, but also if they cause any sort of third-party property damage as well, they're also covered for liability. It does take time for that paperwork to be completed by the employer and the student. It also takes time at our end for it to be reviewed, make sure it's all properly completed, so you are actually covered, and that it's signed off by our principal, Anita Taylor. So you need to allow some time for that, and I would say at least a week, at least. Not really appropriate for a student to be coming to us on a Friday afternoon saying, Mr. McCart, I've got a placement organised for Monday, here's my paperwork. Okay, we do need time for it to be signed off before you can start working. Okay, very quickly then, just on to VET, which is the other reason students have a 3-day timetable and one day off per week. Unlike work placement, there is here a definite requirement that students must complete 90 hours of VET training. Okay, now typically this will be covered by a student completing their certificate. So say a Cert 2 in plumbing or hairdressing, early childhood. 90 hours is roughly the equivalent of 1 semester's worth of VET training. However, it's not absolutely necessary for that to be all made up by the one certificate. Students can actually do bits and pieces of different certificates. Again, this sort of try before you buy option. As long as they successfully complete modules that add up to 90 hours, they meet the requirement. So yeah, VET is one way to gain a technical qualification to become a plumber or a hairdresser to work in childcare. And it is usually expected if you want to go on to apply for an apprenticeship or a traineeship. Very hard if your students will come to me and say, Mr. McCart, I want an apprenticeship, but they have no work experience and they haven't completed any VET training. They're going to be competing against students who are on the way to completing, say, a Cert 2 or a Cert 3 in that industry area, and maybe have several months, if not years, of work experience. So really, just as a rule of thumb, not exclusively, but typically by the end of Year 12, by the end of next year, we will have expected all of our VCAL students to have completed either a Cert 2 or a Certificate 3 by the end of the year. Okay, it is this vocational pathway. It's an important part of the VCAL certificate. Okay, but we understand that things go wrong. Sometimes it turns out to not be the pathway they thought they wanted to do, and they don't necessarily get the 90 hours. But there are other options available. Sarah, at this point, can I invite you just to talk briefly about the short course options that students have available to them now?
Absolutely. So it was hoping to have it run towards the end of term 3, or it commenced towards the end of term 3, but obviously with restrictions and things, we've pushed it out to start in term 4. So the students may have spoken to you in relation to what's called the VCAL90 program. What that essentially is for the students at risk of not completing their VCAL and achieving their VCAL certificate due to nominal hours not being completed. What we're doing is running the VCAL90 program for those students and also other students that may be interested. So the VCAL90 program is a one-day program ran over 5 days. At this stage, it's going to be run week 1 to week 5. So week 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of term 4. Now, during those 5 days, the students will be sitting and getting their responsible service of alcohol, or their RSA certificate. They'll get their food safety and food handling certificates. They'll also get their certificate in preparing and serving espresso coffee, preparing and serving non-alcoholic beverages, and also first aid. So that's a total of 93 nominal hours. So that will then hopefully give them enough to be able to complete and receive their VCAL certificate. So in order for the students to successfully complete the VCAL90 program, they need to complete all the additional theory-based learning, which is going to support each unit of competency for those individual certificates or short courses. So I do have a list of students who have expressed their interest in that. If we haven't already got your name and details, that's fine. We've still got plenty of time, and we can always add more students to those classes. Now, does
that mean if there are, Sarah, if there are students out there who are listening thinking, oh, I might be at risk of failing my VET, and we're not aware of that, or they're looking at that course you just outlined and thinking, geez, that would look good on my resume, or I'd love to be able to work in a cafe part-time. Yeah. There are spots available for them.
There certainly are spots available. We do encourage all students to really seriously consider it, because having those things on your resume is going to give you, at least one foot in the door above another applicant who hasn't got those certificates there. And just another thing, I've had a few queries about the RSA, or the Responsible Service of Alcohol. That one can be completed by students who are not 18. However, it just means that they can't actually use a certificate until they turn 18. So they wouldn't be getting a job serving alcohol unless they were 18 anyway. So that's fine if you're not 18. You can still do that component of the VCAL90 program. Were there any other questions there?
That all sounds good. So yeah, if you're interested, please get in touch, let us know, and we'll explore getting a spot for you in that job camp. Thanks, Sarah. All right. Just to finish then, very, very briefly, the other thing I just wanted to reinforce for our students and our parents, especially those who are looking at going forward into Year 12, is the applied part of VCAL. So it is the Victorian Certificate of Applied Learning. And what that means is it's an alternative to the conventional way of learning, the theory-based learning in a traditional classroom, which is very sort of textbook-based, theory-based. Applied learning is very experiential, so students have opportunities to go out into workplaces, into community settings, and to do much more practical and hands-on work. Okay, so for some people it's very exciting and really plays to their strengths. However, there are certain demands that come with it. And it's really important to understand that while it's a different way of learning, it's not necessarily an easier way of working. And we expect our students coming in to work very hard and to demonstrate the kind of aptitudes, skills, effort that would get them employed out in the real world. Okay, so that's a good way to think of it, the things that would make me employable. The other thing to bear in mind is, and some students may have come into VCAL this year and be now more aware of this than they were at the start of the year, that there are certain elements of applied learning that can be very challenging. For example, lots of group work and social interaction, community interaction, but also peer-to-peer interaction in personal development skills, but also in work-related skills. And to some extent in numeracy and literacy, because they are taught in a way that makes them much more relevant to a real workplace setting. So you practice maths and literacy in ways that you're more likely to do it in the real world. Some students will find the interpersonal aspects very demanding, the sort of initiative that's required to run a project demanding as well. So not necessarily a reason not to do VCAL, but something to be mindful of and to be aware of that your children may be struggling with, and to support them through that. Okay, and if you're a student listening to this, just to be thinking ahead to next year and thinking of the challenges that poses for you. It's not just about the workbook work that you do. Okay, it is also about the other soft skills that you bring, your interpersonal skills, and how well you work in teams and work with others. And then finally, really the last point for the evening is just to emphasise that in applied learning, regular and active participation is really important. Okay, it's not the sort of subject where you can have a lot of absences, miss a lot of this sort of experiential group-based work, and then expect to come in to make it up by just completing a part of a textbook or dashing off an essay or something like that. A lot of the learning is done actively in the classroom. If you miss those active learning experiences, you miss essentially a lot of what VCAL is about, and it makes it very hard for your teachers to assess you and for you to be successful, and could actually end up being the difference between you passing and failing. So yeah, applied learning is just much more than theory work and involves these other elements that you need to be prepared to develop and have a go at. I'd like to thank everyone for attending to that. Hopefully there was some useful information there. It's given you a bit clearer idea of the pathway to VCAL in Year 12, the pathway to exiting at the end of this year to go to an apprenticeship or full-time work. You have a better sense of work placement and how it fits into VCAL and the role that VET plays as well. And importantly, you understand the demands of applied learning, and those expectations increase, become more demanding as you go into Year 12. It steps up again. Sarah, is there anything else you'd like to add at this point?
No, that's all fine. If there are any students that would like any more information or assistance or some extra support, by all means reach out either via Teams, via Compass, any which way, that's fine. We're here to support you and help you get through this time. So by all means, shoot any questions through.
Yeah, good point. Of course, I'd just take the moment to thank Aidan Edwards, who's been in the background organising this event, working tirelessly as always and very professional in his approach, and has done another great job putting this together for us at short notice. So thank you, everyone. As always, reach out. Any further questions, please approach us through the usual channels, and we look forward to working with you and your students through the end of this year and perhaps into next year as well. So wish you a good evening.
Mount Clear College, providing outstanding opportunities and pathways that inspire individual excellence.